my name is Melinda. I'm the Life Enrichment Director here, but this is one of our most special programs I think that we offer here at Jackson Creek, is when we get to have our very own residents present for you or do something that's special to them. And so Dr. Krekorian, I think this is probably his 4th presentation for us here at Jackson Creek. He's done some before on his time in the Vietnam War, and also the Korean War. We've heard this talk before, but for most of you, it's brand new. And him and his lovely wife, Patricia, were one of our very first residents here back in 2018. And so we're just really so blessed that he's here with us and excited to share about his military experience. And he, I don't know if you know this, but Dr. Ed was in World War II as well. He spent time in a few battles in the Pacific, from what I understand. He's then obviously was in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And he has, if I have them right here, he's written, did you know that he's written 4 books? And I'm the very lucky, blessed recipient of a couple of those books. This is his most recent, Operation Turtle Rock. And then he also has this one on, look at that book. And it's a novel, and it's about the Vietnam War. So these are available, and he doesn't know that I'm telling you this, but they're available on Amazon. So I know some of our residents have purchased these on Amazon, and then they've had him sign them for him, or for them. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ed. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I would like to give a brief biography, and I will make it brief. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, enlisted in the Marine Corps at the age of 17, spent 18 months in the Pacific, primarily in Operation Cartwheel, the neutralization of the great Japanese air and sea base, Rabaul. After the war, I attended Edmond University in Atlanta for 3 years, studying subjects in which I had no interest. And when the Army offered me a direct commission, I accepted with alacrity. Then came the Korean War. You'll hear about that now. And after leaving Korea, I worked as an intelligence officer in New York City. Then went to medical school, ended up as director of head and neck surgery at Walter Reed during most of the Vietnam War. And in 1970, I had enough time to retire. Johns Hopkins and WashU offered me the chairmanship of head and neck surgery, but I had a higher obligation. I felt I needed to go to Vietnam, which I did. I served as a division surgeon. That's the chief surgeon of the largest division in Vietnam. Then got promoted, commanded a 400-bed hospital at Long Binh. Came home, joined the faculty at University of Colorado School of Medicine. Eventually took over the directorship of head and neck surgery at Denver Health and Hospitals. Retired, joined the Colorado Mountain Club, and had a lot of fun. Okay, that's my career. The Yellow River with this thing, but you'll have to identify those. There's Tokyo, Japan, and the most southern province is the most important because there's an air base there. There's South Korea, North Korea, China, the Soviet Union. Now we go to the big map. Let's see if I can. These are important landmarks. the Yalu River, the border between Manchuria and North Korea, Pyongyang, the capital, Incheon, Seoul, Osan, the Kum River, Daejeon, and finally the Pusan perimeter, Pohang-dong, Daegu, Mason, and Pusan. And I'll refer to these repeatedly, and you should try to remember where they are. Okay, this begins on 25 June 1950, when 23-year-old Second Lieutenant Ed Krekorian, that's me, boarded a train at Washington's Union Station for Atlanta, Georgia, an impending marriage to Patricia Ann James, the sister of my best friend, another lieutenant. About the same time, 135,000 well-trained, well-equipped, well-motivated North Koreans came across the 38th parallel, where you see those red arrows, and 3 days later they were at the gates of Seoul. Many things happened on the 28th of June. President Truman ordered the Army, the Air Force and the Navy to defend South Korea. 3 bridges across the Han River, which you can see very easily there, were blown up. One bridge with 900 people on it, still on it when it was blown, resulted in the deaths of all 900. You'll see that blown bridge later on. Finally, Seoul was captured on the 30th of June 1950. Patricia and Ed were wed, and as a wedding present, President Truman committed ground troops to the defense of Korea. 3 days later, Incheon was taken by the North Koreans, and then Osan. There was one battalion from the 24th defending Osan. They were just rolled over. And finally, they came to the Kum River. There were 3 major battles there over from the 7th to the 20th of July. Finally, the UN troops were overcome, and they had to retreat down to the Pusan perimeter. They were followed rapidly by the North Koreans, who were stopped at the Naktung River, where you see those 2 arrows. And by the 4th of August, the Pusan perimeter was firmed, which you see there. Pohang-dong, pay particular attention to its location, because you'll be seeing it over and over again. Daegu was noted for its rosy red apples, and if you ignore the fact that human feces was used as fertilizer, they're supposed to be very tasty. And Mason and Pusan. Up until September and the Incheon landing, the North Koreans were trying to penetrate the Naktung River and break up the Pusan perimeter and send the 8th Army back to Japan. In all of this, where in the world is Second Lieutenant Krekorian? Well, on the 20th of July, he bid goodbye to his bride and flew to Tokyo, with a number of stops in between, obviously. And they didn't seem in any hurry to get me into Korea for some reason. So I spent 3 days languishing in Tokyo. Finally, they gave me a ticket to Ishia, which is in the most southern province of Japan. It's a military air base, and I spent a couple of days there, and then finally got on a flight to Busan. We landed about 11 o'clock at night. I spent the night on a couple of picnic benches in the mess hall. After I ate breakfast, I loaded aboard a Curtiss C-46, which is like a DC-3, except on steroids, got a fat belly. My fellow passengers were mostly reporters, newsreel photographers, and news photographers. The takeoff seemed uneventful, except when I looked out the window, I was looking at ocean, the Sea of Japan, and I was flying east using the sun as a compass guide. Now, what in the world are we going back to Japan for? Well, I noticed a lot of the photographers were at the windows on the left side. So I went over there, and this is what I saw out the window. A good part of the wing of the C-46 was missing. It's testimony to the stability of that aircraft that it didn't roll over, because when part of the wing goes, the opposite wing has more lift than necessary, and that will roll the plane upside down. So we were over the Sea of Japan flying back to Ishia, because there are no repair facilities in Korea. In case we had to ditch, which was a possibility, there was a World War II flying fortress, still had the guns in the turret, with a lifeboat underneath with a bombs used to be. Well, the flight to Ishia was uneventful. I spent 2 days there waiting for a flight, finally about a mile below the city. Next, this shows you the extent of damage. There's a story that goes with this. I sent these photographs to my father-in-law, who happened to be in a theater when the newsreel was shown, and he prevailed on the manager to cut him out a little piece of that film. Next slide. This is what he saw. It's identical to the photographs that I took. However, the monologue was markedly different, and it convinced me that news people, especially reporters and photographers, lie when it's convenient. The monologue said this was a spotter plane damaged by anti-aircraft fire, which was a lot of baloney. Okay, we eventually landed at, I had trouble remembering the name of that base, Yonel Air Base, which is just south of Pohang. Next. And this was my CP command post. It's a ditch, L-shaped ditch, about 4 feet in diameter. It's great when people are shelling you, but when it rains, it becomes a bit uncomfortable. This is a wash rack. You can put your helmet there, empty a canteen of water, and shave, actually take a bath. What you see there is the airstrip. There are two fighter squadrons of F-51s there, and on the other side is the rest of Pohang and Yongo Harbor. Next, it's part of our own defense. Next, I had an outdoor CP, and when things got dicey, I'd grab the telephone and so forth and run to the protected CP, and my radio operator, who also doubled as telephone operator, grabbed the phones and stuff. North Korea invaded Pohang along with its invasion of trying to cross the Naktom. And while during the day they apparently had very little artillery, we weren't shelled, but at night there was a lot of probing with squads of North Koreans trying to infiltrate. The infantry protected the area, but they needed backup, and our backup was what you'll see a little later, what we call an M16, had 4 machine guns, 50 calibers, and we would fire 25 to 75 yards in front of them, where presumably the North Koreans were. We did have the benefit of flares from a destroyer out in the harbor and from artillery flares, but they had their disadvantages. They went out after a few minutes. You had a tendency to watch them, and then when they went out, you were blind for a few minutes. And the North Koreans took advantage of that. Next slide. The North Koreans were eventually driven out into the Taebaek Mountains that were northwest of Pohang. And the Air Force, they took all their airplanes to Japan. They left everything else, and you can see a little better. By the way, all of these black and white photos, well, most of them, were taken with a $6 baby Brownie camera, bakelite thing. I bought it at the PX at Fort McPherson. It was limited to 8 exposures of 126 film. This is the abandoned control tower. This is the runway here. This is a crack of something. And above that is the Yongo Harbor, where a destroyer intermittently, yeah, you can see Yongo Harbor. And beyond that is Pohang. A destroyer intermittently used to go in there and fire illumination flares at night. And one day it came in and started firing into Pohang. And a few minutes later, this huge geyser of water erupted very close to the destroyer. When that happened, they put on a lot of smoke and disappeared. And the North Koreans did come up with artillery, and they fired most of their artillery during the day, and during the night they subsided so that their troops could infiltrate. The general in command of the 8th Army decreed that Powhatan could be abandoned, but that the airfield must be held at all costs. That was not good news. I used to go up in this tower when I could, when it was safe, and write letters to Patricia and read her letters. Behind this tent, which is the operations tent, is the base exchange. The Air Force left everything, including all the goodies in the base exchange, and we were given permission to take whatever we wanted. I got a box of Dutch Master cigars. I used to go up there and smoke, and the guys got me a box of Hershey bars, but they cleaned out that place like a bunch of locusts. Okay, next. You may be wondering what happened to my bride. Well, she was in graduate school when she married me. That ended her graduate studies. She was an art major, and she was able to get a job teaching art appreciation at a high school where most of the students she taught were 17 and 18, and she was just 20 years old. And, maintaining discipline was a good problem for her. This car was a wedding present from her parents, and boy, was it a wonderful gift. It lasted many years. Next slide. In retaliation of the shells that the North Koreans were dropping on us, I took my M19s, and you'll see what those are later, up to the shore and fired across Yonville Harbor at where I thought those artillery were firing from. And we started a bunch of fires. I don't know how much good we did. Next slide. This is the M19. It's an M24 tank converted to mount these twin 40mm cannons that have a range of about 3,500 yards. And they have a tracer burnout point that explodes the shell at that distance. These are all World War II equipment. We were using gasoline engines. It had twin Cadillac engines. And we could have become easily crispy critters had we got a good hit. Next slide. This is M16, has a white engine of about 140 horsepower, and go about 35, 40 miles an hour. Its armament was 4 50 caliber machine guns, and it had the reputation of creating havoc, and it had a euphemistic nickname, Whispering Death. It created a lot of death, but it hardly whispered when those 4 machine guns fired at the same time. That's probably why I'm so damn deaf now. Next slide. And this is a M39 converted personal carrier that was full of radios and ammunition. You'll see more of it later. Next. Came the miracle at Incheon. I can't believe how grateful I am to the 1st Marine Division and Army units that managed to take Incheon and cut off the North Korean supply line. Well, that was on the 15th of September. The 16th, 8th Army broke out of the Pusan perimeter, and all of us ended up on the west coast, the main highway going north. And this is one of the this is a shot of some of the troops moving north, and you can see them all the way up there. What you see here is the M16 with the quadruple mounted 50 caliber machine guns. They were interspersed among the troops in case we ran into some kind of resistance. Next slide. As we proceeded north towards Daejeon, and you remember Daejeon was right close to the Kum River, this is what we encountered, the kind of destruction that just what you see now in Ukraine that the Russians are committing. Next slide, just a recapitulation of that. We finally reached the southern outskirts of Daejeon, and we had moved so fast they gave us a day off to do whatever we wanted. We found out there was a shower unit about 2 miles from where we were bivouacked, so the lieutenant, the other platoon and I got our towels and toilet articles and headed for the hot shower. We hadn't had a shower since August, and this was almost 1st of October. On the way, we saw an old man, traditional car, carrying a large bundle on an A-frame. We decided to give the old man a ride, but first we checked out his bundle. What it was is a 3-year-old boy with a horrible abdominal wound, and he looked moribund then. Well, the showers were forgotten as we tried to find a hospital. What we found was a converted school that had a red flag, a red cross out in front of it, and a South Korean flag. So we presumed that was a makeshift hospital. I ran ahead while my companion carried the little boy, and when I opened the door and looked in the corridor, I was shocked. I was hit by a wave of undulating moans, groans, people crying out, and the floor, there were very few stretchers. Most of the people lay on the floor on blankets or ponchos. When I went into what used to be the gymnasium, its floor was covered with wounded, suffering, dead and dying people. The stench was overwhelming. Many of the people were still bleeding. There was dried blood everywhere, as well as vomitus and feces. I had to be careful where I stepped. The people would look at you as though you were their savior. I was just a second lieutenant. I didn't know anything about medicine. I didn't know what to do. We found an empty stretcher and put the little boy on it. The doctor eventually came, examined him, and pronounced him dead. And that was my exposure to. As I was going out, several women held out their arms to me as though they thought I could. I don't know what they thought. It's a scene that remains vivid today as it did then. I'll never forget it. Maybe it had some impact on my decision to study medicine. Anyway, we continued north until we got to the Han River. Next slide. This is a pontoon bridge laid down by Army engineers. You see the Han Bridge that was dropped with 900 people on it. Beyond that, we crossed over the Han Sul and continued north. Next, we took quarters and empty places where we could find them. This is my I had an assistant. Boy, was I. Next. Next. That's a yak. This is Krekorian. Next. This is Ewell Women's College. And I went through it just out of curiosity. The upper 2 floors were just blown to pieces when a bunch of rounds from the 3rd field, the 5.55, we called it the triple nickel, landed short on the roof. Next slide. It was Ewell Women's College. I think it was funded by the Methodist Church. And in going through it, I found about a dozen Hammond organs. That's a runner to the current superb electronic organs. But there's no electricity. I had an interest in organs for a while. And about maybe 50 years later, Patricia and I went to an organ recital at Denver University. And the recitalist was a professor from Ewell Women's College. She's a young woman, but a fantastic performer. I gave her a bunch of photographs that I had taken, and in return she offered to play an encore for me, whatever I selected. Well, when I was courting Patricia, and I got her a room at Fort, in Maryland, I've forgotten the name of the fort. I played the Prelude and Fugue in A minor by Bach for her to impress her. And I asked this professor to play that for us, which she did. Oh man, it was, you couldn't believe how well she played. Okay, we have to move on. Next slide. Crossing the Imjin River. We call it the Crazy Imjin because in some parts it went north-south and other parts it went east-west. But on the other side is North Korea. Now, going back a little bit to October 1st, the Republic of Korea Division crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea. 3 days later, Zhou Enlai, Premier of China, asked the Indian ambassador Manaka to come to his quarters. Zhou Enlai was a premier of China. He told Manaka, that's not his name, what is his name? Tanaka, that China had no objections to South Korea going into North Korea. But if Eighth Army, the United Nations, crossed the 38th peril, China would react militarily. Well, 9 days later, on the 9th of October, we crossed into North Korea. MacArthur's command thought he watched too many movies instead of paying attention to intelligence. He's a strange guy. He came from Germany, and he had originally a German name, Adolf Karl something G. For a while, he had been the advisor to Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain. And I don't know how he came to be selected as MacArthur's intelligence officer. MacArthur referred to him as his personal fascist. He had the shortcoming, which is deadly among intelligence officers, of trying to perceive what your commander wanted to hear. And then you said it. MacArthur was convinced that the Chinese were bluffing. So the invasion of North Korea continued. In fact, MacArthur had hopes of invading China. He's a little off the deep end. He convinced President Truman that if China had the temerity of crossing the Yalu into North Korea, they would be demolished. Unfortunately, Truman believed him. Unfortunately, he believed that. We continued north. Next slide. These are North Korean prisoners marching off to a prisoner pen next. There's some North Korean scenes next. Women at the and Miller next. These three guys we were suspicious of. The habit of the North Korean soldiers were to pretend to be refugees, and then at night cross over behind the U.S. troops and commit mayhem. Next slide. And troops on the way to the front. Next slide. This was a field commanded by an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Dean Hess. When our troops were passing by, they could smell hot food. And they hadn't had a hot meal in days. And they said, "Hey, Lieutenant, can you get us a hot meal?" So I tried. Talked to the Air Force First Sergeant. Said, "Well, you have to talk to Colonel Hess." Colonel Hess was Colonel Dean Hess. And you'll hear about him in a few minutes. He said, "Certainly we'll feed your men," and he insisted that I join him at his mess, which I did. I learned that Colonel Hess had commanded a squadron of F-51 in Britain during World War II, and on a raid he was coming back, still over Germany, and a 500-pound bomb hung up on his bomb rack. Unfortunately, it came loose while he was still over Germany. He was going to try to drop it over the English Channel. The bomb hit a German orphanage and killed 60 or 70 children. That weighed very heavily on Colonel Hess. And when the war ended, he entered seminary and became a Presbyterian minister. And he was at his as an assistant pastor at his first church when the Korean War started. He was called back to active duty to build up the South Korean Air Force. While he was commanding this field, and this is the field just north of Pyongyang called K9, he and the squadron chaplain rounded up North Korean orphans, and Colonel Hess arranged to have them flown down to an orphanage in South Korea. He wrote a book, next slide, called Battle Hymn. That's supposedly Colonel Hess. And Hollywood made a movie of it. You'll never guess who played Colonel Hess. What the heck was his name? I can't remember now, but it was a well-known actor. I'll think of it later. Okay, next slide. Things were getting cold. This was my second assistant, Chuck Dawson, collecting wood for the night. I didn't get to live comfortably. Next slide. Okay, where we were heading was to a small airfield about 20 miles south of the Yalu River. And that's where we were around the 1st of December when a large group of Chinese troops attacked and practically eliminated South Korean division. Then the Chinese troops disappeared. Again, that this was a feint. Well, the heck, he was about as wrong as you could get. And pretty soon, he's up on the foothills, firing down on you. And the Chinese supply line was much extended. They had no way of taking care of their casualties. Either the casualties died on their own, or some people, some units, they shot the casualties that were obviously non-recoverable. Around the 17th of February, earlier than that, at the end of January, I transferred to the 3rd Infantry Division and was put in command of the 2nd Platoon, 3rd AAA. Next slide. You can't imagine the horrible conditions the ground troops had to endure. If they got frostbite, they couldn't walk anymore, and they were loaded as much as possible on tracked vehicles, trucks, anything. Next slide. This is embedded in me. It was a very humiliating defeat. We were just running for our lives, practically. Next slide. And here you see somewhere Seoul, yeah. There's Seoul and the Han River, and we're still south. Well, the 16th of February and the 17th, General Ridgway initiated his first offensive, and as its name indicated, our mission was to kill the enemy wherever we found it. You worked with either the Air Force, the Army Infantry, or on your own to find the enemy and killed them. The operation was called Operation Killer, and it was handicapped somewhat by the weather. I would be all set to give the command to open fire on the most juicy target you can imagine, and they were unsuspecting. And all of a sudden the rains would come. Visibility went from a couple miles down to about 6 feet. And I just stood there with the telephone waiting to give the command and for the rain to stop. And I remember opening up a can of ham and beans and water dripping off my helmet into the can, so it was sort of ham and bean soup. It was cold, but it was tasty. Next slide. I had to put this photograph. This is my platoon sergeant, Rick Mahalik. We became very close. I depended on him a great deal. Sometimes I split my platoon and gave him half to go off and do his things. After the war, I tried to get him a direct commission, but he refused because he'd have to spend an extra 2 years on active duty. After the war, we made contact maybe 20 years later, and he had become a very successful contractor. Next slide. This is what we call whispering death. I had to take 2 or 3 South Koreans for on-the-job training. The training didn't amount to much because they could not speak English, and I sure couldn't speak South Korean. Next slide. And this is M19 with the twin cannons. Next slide. And this is my command vehicle. The driver somehow found a skull and wired it on there, and I gave him a half-smoked cigar to wire to the jaw, and we created quite a publicity for the 3rd AAA. Next slide. Here we are supporting the infantry. The infantry has designated an area of about 500 yards with white phosphorus grenades or mortar grenades, I'm not sure what. I've got the gunners online. They're to fire between the 3 smoke grenades, and the U.S. infantry, they weren't going to take the hill, they just I better sit down before I fall down. They were in the foreground, so we were firing over their heads. I tell you, that's a unique experience when a bunch of 50 calibers are snapping over your head, maybe 4 or 5 feet over your head. They impact 25 to 75 yards in front. Next slide. Some of the opportunities we took care of on our own. This is the M19 firing, and it's raising hell over there. Next slide. If you were unfortunate enough to come within range of the whispering death, that's what awaited you. This is a truck that one of the M16s fired on. There's not much left of it after it quit burning. Next slide. This is SU-76. It's what gave me heartburn because it was much better armed than anything I had. And if we tried to duke it out with them, we were going to lose. Next slide. It obviously lost. This is a T-34, an excellent tank. It could go 53 miles an hour over rough terrain. My tanks could go only 35 miles an hour. We sure as heck couldn't outrun them, much less the armor that they had. And to compensate for that risk, next slide, an Air Force ground forward observer was assigned to my platoon. This is an Air Force major in his 40s. He's not on flight status for medical reasons. He's in his mid-40s. I used to call him Uncle Jim. Uncle Jim came with a master sergeant, driver, and radio operator. And we knocked out a lot of North Korean armor. Once they thought my platoon was all that was there, he would bring in either F-51s, which either machine gun or drop Maytom, or B-26s, which was heavily, and sometimes what they did, I felt so sorry for the enemy. Next slide. These offensives generated a lot of refugees. This is one that generated from Operation Killer, the Civil Affairs Killer. These folks had no food. We provided a cup of rice per day, per person, provided they allowed themselves to be deloused. And here you see them lining up. Next slide. He's getting this cup of rice. Next slide. Can you go back to that? There's a lot of emotion in that lady's features there, of suffering and dignity and anything else you want to read into it. Next slide. This describes an incident that altered probably my goals in life. We were sent on a mission to extricate 2 tanks that had been stuck in the sand, and their crews had been ambushed, and the tank retriever troop had been ambushed, and there were about 60 U.S. troops trapped in that area by several hundred Chinese troops, and it looked like a very precarious position for them. So we managed to deal with the enemy troops and managed to pull their tanks out of the sand. Got written up in the division newspaper. General Meade, the assistant division commander, commended the platoon and gave me an attaboy, which didn't amount to much, except he decided he wanted my platoon up at division headquarters as a sort of fire brigade. And so we went on TDY up to division headquarters. Next slide. And you can see my CP tent there. And we had our radios and telephones in there. Division headquarters was about It must be 4 o'clock. We're getting close to the end. Division headquarters was about 75 yards west. And I used to go over there and hang out. We did the mess. We had fairly good food. And hang out at G3 or saw how war was carried out at the higher level. Next slide. I'll skip this next. By accident or luck, whichever way, we stumbled onto this view. These 4 hills were just covered with enemy troops. And I presume that those huts house the command structure. Well, I brought all the gunners up, showed them their targets. The 50 calibers fired on these hills. These twin 40s fired into that area there and just destroyed that, everything there. Started a lot of fires, a lot of smoke. Then we got the heck out of there in a hurry. I'm not sure what the results were. All this was going on during mid-September. On the eve of September 22nd, a large, immense Chinese army went into the offensive. Next slide. And this is what's left of Division Forward, the headquarters. I'll identify these folks later. My day began with the orders to bring up the rear of the division train that was retreating, which I did. And then I got orders to pull my tracks out of the retreating division and find high ground and protect the rear. And about the time I got the last track into position, I got orders to go extricate a battalion headquarters and its company from a roadblock. As I was doing that, two British Centurion tanks pulled up, and they had been given orders to take care of the roadblock. I was to report to General Meade immediately. Okay, when I get to division headquarters, General Meade was sitting on a rock in conference with Colonel Magnuson in the G3. This guy, never knew his name, but he's from 10th Corps as a liaison officer. We always referred to him as a spy. General Meade told me to pull up a rock. The situation was this. The Gloucestershires were hit very hard, British battalion, hit very hard by the Chinese. And they were given permission by their commander, Brigadier Brodie, to get to friendly lines any way they could. There were 16 severely wounded who could not be moved, or who could not move. And General Meade, who never gave me a direct order, I always thought that I was volunteering, asked if I would be willing to take my platoon and try to rescue these 16. He had taken away my air cover, had no artillery support, no infantry support. I was bare. And that's when good old Marine Corps ethos takes over. You do not abandon comrades. They weren't Marines, but they were comrades. and I certainly volunteered to go. A doctor and a chaplain had elected to stay with them, with the wounded, and go into captivity. So we rescued them too. Next slide. We're getting brief now. This is the G3 section for a 18,000 man division. Next slide. I retired to my office and made plans for the maneuver, and these are just rolled up maps and so forth. My platoon sergeant was gassing up the platoon and rearming, getting all the ammunition they could. Next slide. We were going north, and this is a remnant of the British Gloucesters. Excuse me. Going south. They were going south to safety. We were going north where there was no safety, only danger. Finally, a road guide in a jeep found us and took us to where the wounded were gathered. There were some on stretchers, some on ponchos, and I took a look over the berm, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of enemies, not more than 800 to 1,000 yards away from us. Within minutes, they would be on top of us. Oh, thank you. Water. I was expecting a martini. And it was such a juicy target that I brought all the M16s up, that's 1650 caliber machine guns. And while the most seriously wounded were being loaded over the grills of the M19s, they were on stretchers. The stretchers were wired to the kit. The M16s, the whispering death, began to whisper their death knell for all those enemies that were coming towards us. That gave us a few minutes to get organized. Finally, everybody was loaded. We were low on ammunition, low on fuel. Well, we wouldn't be in trouble if we encountered any enemies. I had no idea where to go. My road guide was gone. But I knew if we headed southwest, we would eventually intersect the main line of resistance, the road. If we intersected north of the Chinese, we were in trouble. I would have had no choice but to surrender, because we had little ammunition. My tracks were covered by wounded. If they had any hope of surviving, it was as a prisoner of war. Luckily, we intersected right where my commander, Captain Tony Zelenko, was sitting in a jeep. The first thing he said was, "Where the hell have you been?" And I could have hugged him. And he said, follow me. He led us about 20 to 30 miles south, almost to the Han River, to a line that was established for the retreating division. It had no name, so they gave it a name, the no-name line. And the wounded were taken into the emergency room. I held the door open with my back, and as the wounded were carried on stretchers, they would grab my arm or my hand, and "God bless you, Yang. God bless America. God bless you, Lieutenant. It was an emotional moment. Once they were all in the emergency room, I went in to see that they were being taken care of, and the doctors found out that I had been responsible for their rescue from out of the noses of the Chinese, and they invited me to watch their treatment of the wounded. The nurse gave me a gown, a cap, and a mask, and suddenly I felt different. I had on the garments of almost a religious connotation. These people were saving lives. They were not taking lives. All I had done was take lives. It really impacted me very hard. We were ordered to spend the night at the hospital. My sergeant, bless his heart, was able to get some hot food for the troops. And I spent the night more or less watching the surgery done. In the morning at breakfast, I ate with the staff and then made rounds on the patients that I had, the 16 they had brought in. Something really overcame me. It was almost a spiritual moment. All the suffering that I had seen, what I had seen in the hospital, I could have done something had I been a doctor. And it was that moment that I decided I had to become a doctor. There was no choice. It was made for me. Maybe the Almighty made it for me. I hope so. I hope He could help me get into medical school with my grades. Next slide. After we reached the no-name line, I was ordered to turn my platoon over to my assistant and report to headquarters. And there I was told I had enough combat points that I would be going home. So, next slide. This is where we went from Incheon to Sasebo. We spent about 4 days at Sasebo, Japan. We got new uniforms, got shots, physical examinations, so on and so forth, and loaded on a ship, Magic Carpet Express. And this was a troop ship that would take us home in about 3.5, 4 weeks. Next slide. It was a very, it's hard to describe. I was in a stateroom with 4 double-decker bunks and 8 guys, 8 officers, and it was an opportunity for catharsis because at night with lights out more or less, all we talked about is what we did. It was a great substitute for psychiatric interview. And we ate off tables with white tablecloth and family style, and had 2 sittings. You could take your choice. It got very boring after the first week, so I volunteered for officer of the guard. Mostly I checked up on the troops and made sure there was no trouble going on. But I did have the advantage of a little office, a typewriter, and paper. And I wrote my first article that was published a year later in the any aircraft journal. And unfortunately, it was written with the intent of making more efficient the killing of enemy troops by self-propelled anti-aircraft. Next slide. Here come the Marines to welcome us with their beautiful Corsair plane into Seattle Harbor. Fireboats came out with their hoses, fire hoses next. This is the pier. There was a band there. People had come to welcome us. The wife of one of my very best friends, Marge Jorgensen, was there. She met me, and next slide. Miss Seattle welcomed us. Next. We drove through the streets of Seattle in marked contrast to our reception from returning from Vietnam. These people were cheering and waving and so forth. We were driven to the local fort and processed, got our airline tickets and so forth. And then Marge Jorgensen met me and took me to the officers club for dinner. And then my plane to Atlanta left at 11, so she took me to the airport. And I was on the plane going home. Next slide. And within days, Patricia and I celebrated our first anniversary. And that's where this story ends. Thank you all for coming again. Now that you know who I am, feel free to stop me in the hallway or in the mess hall and ask whatever questions you want. I'll try to answer them. Keep in mind, I have that problem. Okay. We have 3 guests here. My number 2 son,